Hey, what's going on everybody? Today I'm going to show you how to set up WireGuard site-to-site VPN on an edge router. Now if you've watched my OpenVPN videos, you kind of know already what we're going to do and what a site-to-site VPN is. But if you don't, this is just a way to connect two routers together, basically have them apart as the same network, as well as encrypt traffic over the public internet. What this isn't is one of those client VPNs where like NordVPN or PIA. This isn't one of those you install on your computer and then it hides all your traffic. What this is a connection between two routers, basically functions like a virtual cable, if you will, except for all of that traffic's going over most likely the public internet, and this will encrypt that traffic between those two. Now the main advantage for WireGuard over OpenVPN, at least on an edge router, is speed. If you use OpenVPN, especially on the edge router X, you're going to be limited to between 10 and 20 megabits per second of throughput, and the reason for that is the processor in the edge router X. I mean, it's a cheap device, it's a cheap processor, it's not that fast, and OpenVPN is pretty CPU intensive, so it is limited by the power of the device for the OpenVPN, and that's where WireGuard comes in, and it's a lot less intensive on the CPU, so you can actually get almost the full 100 meg throughput on an edge router X when you're using WireGuard. Now there are three VPNs that I use on the edge routers, and that is the OpenVPN that I've already made a video about, WireGuard that I'm making this video about, and then the third one is the regular just IPsec VPN. And that one is actually the fastest of the three, but the downside is, at least for the way I like to set up VPNs, you can't really create tunnel interfaces and use a host name with it, but that is a topic for another time. So we'll just go ahead and get into this WireGuard video. Now what I'm going to do, I've got two routers, an edge router X and an edge router 4, and they're basically connected back to back, emulating the public internet. So when we do get into these routers, you will see a private address on both of these interfaces, but just kind of ignore that because the concept is the same. They are emulating an actual internet connection. And off of these two routers we have our two PCs, which we're going to be using for configuration. Now just kind of an overview on what we're going to do and how WireGuard is going to be set up. If you're familiar with OpenVPN, you know that we kind of define the IP address or host name of the other end, and then we also define a tunnel interface network, and pretty much just the IPs and host names of each side is what tells the OpenVPN connection where to go. Well, this one we're going to be generating public and private keys, and the public key is actually going to be a part of the configuration, which will also determine where this VPN is going to go. And this will make sense in just a second. So basically we're going to generate a public key on ERX, and we'll just say that's AAA. It's just a long string of numbers basically, and we'll just say that edge router 4 has BBB. Now when we configure up our WireGuard connection, we're going to define the host name for edge router 4's WAN address as well as its public key. So when we configure it on edge router X, it's going to be going to BBB, and then when we configure it on the edge router 4, it's going to be going to AAA. Basically we're just using our destination's public key in the configuration as well as the host name. And we're also going to set up two virtual interfaces, which this is the exact same concept as OpenVPN, where you just create a virtual tunnel interface and assign it an irrelevant IP, and then that is your point-to-point connection between the two routers. Now before we get started, I do have one disclaimer about using WireGuard on an edge router X, and that is that it does not persist through firmware upgrades. So unlike OpenVPN, WireGuard is not built into the edge router itself. There are no installation files for WireGuard. We have to go out, get those ourselves, and download them to the routers. And then once we've done all the setup and everything, if we upgrade those routers and wipe the firmware and do an upgrade, WireGuard basically gets blasted out of the device. So you'll have to go back and re-download WireGuard, reset up your VPNs, most likely generate new public and private keys. So I will be showing you at the end of the video where to back up the files and kind of what to do to keep that information around if you do need to do a firmware upgrade and don't want to lose all of your VPN configuration. But let's go ahead and get right into it here. We are going to start out on the edge router X, and just for a little bit of background, if we open up our internet browser, the IP address of this edge router X is actually 192.168.10.1, and it has the default login of UBNT. So we'll just go ahead and log in there. And we'll go ahead and take a look at the interfaces. So our internet IP, again, this is actually a private IP, but we're going to pretend that this is our internet facing interface, and this is our public IP address, so 10.13.13.103. And we're also going to have 192.168.10.1 as our LAN. Now for WireGuard, we're actually not going to do any of the setup in the graphical interface. We're going to do it all through the command line. If you want to, you can just use this right here in the top corner. It's a link to a web version of the actual command line of the Edgerouter. However, every time you make a change and commit them on this command line in the web interface, it's going to ask you to refresh, because technically you're in the GUI and the GUI has to refresh every time you make a change in the command line, and vice versa. You can't really use both at the same time without just getting annoyed. So we're going to go ahead and download something called PuTTY. If you're not familiar with PuTTY, it is a very valuable tool that everybody who works in networking uses all the time. So we'll go ahead and download the 64-bit putty.exe. And if you go ahead and open that up, you can put in the address of the router. So we're just going to connect to 192.168.10.1 to connect to our Edgerouter X, and go ahead and click open. And it's going to ask us to log in. So regular login information, UBNT, and now we can go ahead and start downloading WireGuard. Now I do have a link down in the description below on where to actually go to download this, but we're going to go ahead and open our web browser again and go to the GitHub for WireGuard on Edgerouter. So if we follow that link, we come to here, and if we scroll down to the installation section, we'll see this download latest release for your model and then install it. If we click on that link for latest release, then here's where it's going to show us all of the different Edgerouter models and all the different package versions for WireGuard. So depending on the model of Edgerouter that you have, it's going to make a difference in what file you actually download. So you can see here, E50 is an Edgerouter X, which is what we're using, so we're going to want package E50. Now on the other end we have an Edgerouter 4, so if we look for that down here in the list, that's designated as E300. And once we know which version our router is, we can scroll down to the bottom, and here are all the actual installation files. So we're going to look for E50, and we'll notice that there are two versions. There's E50 version 1 and E50 version 2. Now these correspond to your firmware version of the Edgerouter. So if we open up our GUI over here, we can see in the top left that we're running firmware version 1.10.11. So since we're on firmware version 1, we're going to want the version 1 file download here. Now I will tell you that on the Edgerouter 4, it's actually running version 2.0.9 hotfix 1, so we're going to want version 2 for our Edgerouter 4 installation. But we're going to go ahead and select E50 version 1, right click that, and copy the link address. We're going to go back to PuTTY, and we're going to issue the command curl-ol, and then if we just right click, it's going to paste that link address, and then we'll click enter, and it's going to should download 2 files. Once those are downloaded, we're going to need to unpack them and install them. So the command for that is sudo dpkg-i for install, and then the file name that we just downloaded. Now what we should be able to do is right click and just backspace all of the path information beyond the file, and it should be good. A lot of times it messes up for me, so we'll go ahead and click enter, and nope, that seemed to work. So now we have installed WireGuard, and it's basically ready for us to configure. Now if we do a list, you can see this is the file that we downloaded. That is the installer for WireGuard. It is on the Edgerouter's file system, just in case you're curious. And the first thing we're going to do to set up WireGuard is issue wg gen key. Then we're going to do a pipe T, and then the path to where we're going to store the private key. So what this is generating your private key. And we're going to store that in config/auth, and we're going to name that wg.key. Now we're also going to do another pipe and generate a public key, and that's just going to be wg pub key. Then we're going to do a little arrow off to the right, and we're going to designate that as wg/public. And once we've done that, if we do a list, we'll see that there are now 2 files on our file system, our WireGuard package file and wg.public. And if we do a vi wg.public, then we can view the actual public key. Now what vi is it's just a Linux-based text editor, similar to Nano if you're familiar with Linux, but this long string of numbers in this file is our public key for WireGuard. So we're going to go ahead and make a note of that. I'm just going to open up Notepad and right click, paste that in there. And I'll just go ahead and label that ERX so we don't get confused. And now to exit out of Vi, just do a shift colon, and then this prompt's going to come up. Do a Q, enter, now you're out of Vi. Now we are ready to configure the actual interfaces. So we're going to enter configure mode. And then a lot of this is going to be very similar to OpenVPN if you're familiar with it. But basically set interfaces WireGuard. Since we installed WireGuard, we now have that option. And we're just going to call this WG0, and we'll define an address for it. And this is going to be our network that we just kind of make up. I'm going to use 10.0.0.0 the network, but 10.0.0.1 and .2. This is just going to be a point-to-point connection, so I'm going to assign it a /30 as a subnet mask. We'll go ahead and click enter, and we'll go ahead and do an up arrow to get that command back and just backspace up to WG0. And then we're going to define a listen port. So listen-port, and we're going to use 51820. Now this 51820 doesn't have to be exact. You can use, I'm pretty sure, any port number you want as long as it doesn't conflict with anything. I wouldn't use anything in the well-known or reserved range. I would use something a lot higher like this 51820. If you do want to have more than one WireGuard tunnel, you're going to have more than one WireGuard interface, and you're going to have multiple different port numbers. So if you are making multiples, you'll just use like 51821 for your next one, 51822 for the one after that. And if you're wondering where I got that number, it was actually on the GitHub for this. If you scroll down a little more, there is a usage section which shows most of these commands. So we've already assigned the address, and now we're assigning the listening port. And we're basically going to go through the rest of this for the rest of the video. So we'll go ahead and go back and get that command back, backspace it up to WG0 again. And we're going to do route allowed IPs, or route-allowed-IPs, and we're going to do true. Now I will be coming back to this command later when we actually set up OSPF. I am going to show you how to set up OSPF with this, and these commands are going to be a little bit different for that. So for now, we're going to leave this as true. And really what this command does is it's going to determine whether or not the IPs that we're going to put in our allowed list show up in the routing table with a kernel route. So as long as this is set to true, all of the allowed IPs that we set for this WireGuard interface are going to automatically go into the router's routing table with a route over the tunnel. If we set that to false, that doesn't happen. And I'll kind of explain why this is beneficial or not beneficial a little bit later. But we'll go ahead and move on. Set interfaces, WireGuard, WG0, and then peer. And this is where we're going to define our peer's public IP. Now we don't have that yet because we haven't been on the Edgerouter 4. So let's go ahead. And I'm over here on the other PC now. This is going to 192.168.1.1, which is our Edgerouter 4. I'm gonna just log in with the UBNT information. You can see we have some different IP addresses over here. And I've already downloaded PuTTY, so we're just gonna open the downloads folder, open that up, and connect to our Edgerouter 4. 192.168.1.1, enter. Login is UBNT, and now we're going to need to go through the WireGuard download phase again so that we can generate our public key. So that command was again curl-ol and then the address of the file which we need for this router. So we're going to go ahead, open up our web browser again, go to that link that should be down in the description, head down to the installation section, latest release. Now we are on an Edgerouter 4, so that's going to be E300. We're going to scroll down to E300, and we are running a version 2 firmware, so we're going to get the link address for E300 version 2. Come back to our command line here, paste that in, press enter, should download 2 files. If we do a list, we can see there is our installation file, and all we have to do is a sudo dpkg-i. And then again, we can just paste in that same thing and just backspace all of the irrelevant information and then press enter. Now we have WireGuard set up, so we can do the WG gen key pipe t/config auth wg.key, and that is for the private key again. And then we'll do another pipe wg pub key, and then the arrow to wg.public. Now if we do another list, we can see our file, and if we use vi wg.public, we can go in and actually view the public key. So we'll go ahead and copy that, which in PuTTY just means highlighting. And if we go back to our other computer, that should still be in the clipboard, at least on here. Since both of my VMs are on the same computer, I can kind of copy and paste between them. You will have to either manually write it down or email it to you, or however you get this number to the destination that you're actually working. That's going to be another logistical nightmare. But I'm going to go ahead and name this Edgerouter 4 and just make sure that that is still in the clipboard. So we can go ahead and paste that as the peer for our Edgerouter X, and we'll do another space. And what we need to do is define the endpoint for this, which is going to be either the IP address of the WAN interface or the host name. Now, one of the main reasons that I use WireGuard is because you can use a DNS host name and use dynamic DNS for your tunnels. That is the main advantage I think it has over the regular IPsec, which will only use the actual IP address. And if you've done much networking before, you'll know that home IP addresses usually change. They're all DHCP. They have the possibility to change, and when they do, it'll break your tunnels unless you're using something like dynamic DNS. So what we're going to do is just define the DNS host name of the other end, and I already have this set up in DNS, at least I should. If you don't, I use NoIP. I think it's noip.org or .net or something. It's a dynamic DNS service that you can sign up for and make your own dynamic host names. So we're going to do Edgerouter 4-remote.hop2.org, and that is going to be the endpoint DNS host name. And we're going to do colon and the port number, which was 51820. And we'll go ahead, click enter, and let's get that command back and just backspace that endpoint. And here's where we're going to define our allowed IPs. So that is allowed-IPs, and then we're going to need one line for basically every network we want to be able to talk over this VPN. So obviously we're going to have our LAN, which is 192.168.10.0/24. And then we'll go ahead and get that command back. We're going to want the tunnel network itself, which is 10.0.0.0/30. And I actually forget if we need to define the remote networks on each side. I want to say no, but I'm going to leave them off for now, and we'll see if we can actually talk when this is finished. But we'll go ahead and commit those changes, and it says commit failed, private key must be specified for WG0. Okay, I forgot a command, so we'll go back, set interfaces, WireGuard, WG0, and then private-key, and the path to our private key, which was /config/auth/wg.key. And we'll go ahead and commit, and it says that the commit failed, and it says allowed IP 10.0 on interface peer conflicts with an existing route. Route allowed IPs cannot be enabled. Oh, okay. I'm actually a little bit of an idiot. Let's go ahead and delete that out. Actually, I'm going to go back where I put in that command. All right, so this is the command I put in for 192.168.10.0. I'm going to go remove set from that, do a delete, and then I'm going to pull up that same command, change it back to set, and instead of 192.168.10.0, we are going to do the remote network, and that's 192.168.1.0. Because like I said before, when we do the that true statement, that's going to add routes to the routing table, and you're not going to add a route to a network that you already have physically connected. That doesn't make any sense. So you're not going to put in your local networks there. You're only going to put in the remote networks. Now let's go ahead and do a commit, and it should go through this time, hopefully. Yep, there we go, we are good. And we can go ahead and save that. And if we do a run show IP route, we should see a kernel route in here, and this is one of our allowed IPs. So this is what I'm talking about when I say it creates a route in the routing table. So we now have this route to 192.168.1.0 via WireGuard 0 interface. Now we do technically have this same route for our tunnel interface, but it didn't give us any error on that one. And you can see that we do have two. Somehow we have an OSPF route. I'm not sure what that's all about, but anyways, Now we just need to set up the firewall to make a rule for that 51820 port number. So our WireGuard configuration is all good. However, when it goes out or when the other end tries to connect to this router, it's going to be coming in on 51820, and we have to poke a hole in the firewall for that. So what we're going to do is set firewall name, and we're going to use our WAN local. So this is the firewall for the actual WAN interface itself. And we're going to specify a new rule. So if we just do a question mark here, or let's type in rule and then do a question mark, we can see our existing rule numbers. So we got 10, 20, and 50. So I'm just going to nestle this right in between 10 and 20 at rule 15. And we're going to do an action of accept. And then let's just get that command back, backspace that action, specify protocol UDP. Again, get that command back, backspace the action, and I'm just going to give it a description. This is optional. This is just so when I see it in the GUI, I'll know what it's all about. I'm just going to call it WireGuard. And then the last thing is going to actually be rule 15 destination port. And this is where you put in that 51820 port number. And then we'll do a commit and another save, and our Edgerouter X should be good to go at this point. So let's just go ahead, swap back over to our other computer for the Edgerouter 4. And we are still in the public key file, so we're going to go ahead and do a shift : put a Q in there to get out of that. And now we basically just do that exact same setup in reverse over here. So we're going to go into configure mode. I'm going to do set interfaces, WireGuard WG0, and we're going to give this an address of 10.0.0.2. So it's on the same network as our other one. And again, it's a /30 network. Go ahead, backspace up to WG0 and do a listen port. Also going to be 51820, backspace to WG0 again. And we're going to do a route allowed IPs true again. And then set interfaces, WireGuard WG0, and then peer. So I saved the public key for our Edgerouter X on the other computer, so we'll go ahead and go back to that, open up our notepad, and I'm going to go ahead and just copy it straight from here. You go ahead and copy it from wherever you had it saved. Now I'm just going to do a little bit of a timeout here. While I was recording, I forgot to switch back to our second PC that's connected to the Edgerouter 4, so I went ahead and explained the rest of the configuration, but realized that it was actually just still recording the first PC. So we're going to go back through, well, I'm going to go back through configuring it from where we left off with the peer. So I still have the peer public IP in my clipboard. We're going to do a set interfaces, WireGuard, WG0, and then peer. Go ahead and paste that in. And then the first thing we're going to do is define the endpoint. And for this, it's going to be Edgerouter x-local.hop2.org. And then we're going to go up, backspace that endpoint command, and we're going to do our allowed IPs. And again, this is going to be the destination networks we want. So here is where we'll put in 192.168.10.0/24. Go ahead, press enter. Mine's going to say that the specified configuration node already exists because I just did this and forgot to record it. Also going to throw in 10.0.0.0/30 for the tunnel network. And I actually just realized on our peer command where we did Edgerouter x-local.hop2.org, we didn't define a port. So we're going to go ahead and add a colon to that and 51820. It will throw back an error if we forget to put that in there. And before I forget, I'm going to go ahead and set interfaces WireGuard WG0 private key, and then the path to our private key, which was config auth wg.key. And again, that already exists. So this is the point where we can just do a commit and a save. And I will say that if you don't already have your DNS hostname set up, it will give you an error when you go to commit it if it can't resolve. Because what WireGuard does is it looks at that command, tries to resolve the IP of the hostname that you put in there, and if it can't, it'll error out and won't actually let you save your configs. So make sure that you either have your DNS set up already or you have the ability to, because it's not going to let you save that until it's able to resolve the DNS name. So we'll go ahead and save that. And at this point, we can just set up the firewall. So set firewall name, again, WAN local, and then we'll do a rule, question mark, and 15. Action, accept, and I misspelled accept. So there we go. and then just get that backspace to rule 15, give it a protocol of UDP, same thing, backspace that, give it a nice description of WireGuard, and then backspace that as well, and do destination port 51820. And again, all of those say it already exists because I messed up on recording the video. At this point, we can go ahead and commit, do a save, and our routers should be good to go with WireGuard now. Now if we exit out of our configuration mode and do a show IP route, we'll just make sure everything looks good. Yep, we have a kernel route to 192.168.10.0, and at least we don't have that weird OSPF route in here on the Edgerouter 4. Still don't know why that was on the Edgerouter X. But to check the status of actual WireGuard, we just do a sudo wg show, and we should have a lot of information here. We got our interface wg0, the public key of it. If you do want another way to find the public key, this is a command you can also run. And then our private key is obviously hidden, gives us our port number. And then the peer we're trying to peer with, this is their public key. This is the endpoint IP address, which is resolved through DNS using that host name that we configured. And then these are our allowed networks that are going to be connected to over the tunnel. So let's go ahead and just try to ping 10.0.0.1, and we do get a response. And if we do a show, or not a show, sudo wg show, we should actually have transfer status now. Yep. So since we tried to initiate a connection to one of those remote networks, it enabled WireGuard, it set up the VPN, and we now have traffic statistics for sent and receive. And we should also be able to ping 192.168.10.1, which is the LAN interface of our other edge router, and we can. So our network is working at this point. Go ahead and cancel that ping. Do a sudo wg show just for, why not? And yep, we have transfer. So let's go ahead and go back over to our other computer on the Edgerouter X. And we'll just do the same verification here. We'll exit out of configure mode, ping 10.0.0.2, which is the Edgerouter 4. Yep, we're good. And also do a ping to 192.168.1.1. Yep, we're good. So now one more thing that I'm gonna do, and this is just kind of to show the speed of it, to prove that it is a little bit quicker. Actually, I'm gonna set up a shared folder on our Edgerouter 4 configuration PC. So we'll just go ahead, make a new folder, call it share, go into the properties here. We'll do sharing, advanced sharing, share this folder, just call it share, close that out. We'll go back to our Edgerouter X PC and try to add that as a network drive. And I believe our IP address of that other computer is 192.168.1.38. And the share was shared, do our 2 backslashes at the beginning, finish. That might not have been our IP, so let's just go ahead and verify that with an IP config. And nope, it's 1.40, not 38. So let's go back, cancel that, put in the right IP/share, and we are now connected. So I'm not really sure if I have any big enough files, but we'll just go ahead and try and just copy this entire Windows 10 upgrade folder, because that sounds fun. Connect to the share, paste it in there. Oh, I need permission to perform that action. Okay. Let's go back to the PC, right click on share, security, and actually sharing, advanced sharing, set the permissions of everyone to allow full control. Now I can actually paste a file in here. So we'll go ahead, paste. And if I can hit more details in time, you can see our speed is, well, doesn't really seem that great. Probably because there's a lot of little files in this folder, but I did see 2 megabytes, so that is promising. But this is also on 2 VMs back to back on the same computer, so that there's a lot of variables on why transfer speed would be a little wonky with this setup. But just take my word for it. I do have actually 2 WireGuard tunnels set up on Edgerouter X's, and I do get basically 10 megabyte throughput, sorry, basically 100 meg on the WireGuard VPNs that I do have. And that does fluctuate a little bit more, so I don't really get the consistency of like an IPsec VPN, but it is a lot faster than an OpenVPN site to site. Now, the last thing that I forgot to mention is kind of what you need to back up so that you can retain this through a firmware upgrade. And really what you need is the public key, the private key, and all of your WireGuard commands. So basically, if we do a list here, you're going to want this WG public, and then if we do a change directory to config auth and then go in there, do another list, you're definitely going to want to copy this wg.key, because when you do set up WireGuard again after your firmware upgrade, if you just generate new keys, they're going to be different. And not only do you have to set it up again on that router that you did the firmware upgrade on, but you got to go to the other end and re-put in those commands with a different public key on the other side. So as long as you can keep these keys and have backups of them, then you can throw them back on there in these two locations after you've done the upgrade. And then at that point, all you have to do is put back in your set commands for the interfaces and you're good to go. And to see your commands, you can do a show configuration commands, and this will show you all of the actual commands that you could put into your router to get it back to the state that it is in right now. So if we just keep going down, we can see set interfaces, WireGuard, whatever. You can just go ahead and highlight that and throw it in a notepad document somewhere. We'll go ahead and go down one more. These should be all of the commands that you need. And it's not exactly pretty to have it like this, but it does save you from having to reconfigure everything. At least you have a backup. And also, you're going to have to find a way to get wg.key and wg.public off of the Edgerouter. I recommend something like WinSCP, where you can get an SCP connection into the router, browse the file system, and then pull them off the router. But anyways, that is everything you need to know to get WireGuard set up on an Edgerouter. So if you were here just to get it set up off the ground and working in a basic configuration, then go ahead and tune out. However, at this point, I'm going to be talking about OSPF for those of us who want to run dynamic routing protocols over these VPNs. So the problem with this setup for me is that I can't run OSPF over it, and the reason for that is because of the route allowed IPs statements. So the way that we have it set up here by default, we're only allowing traffic to the networks that we define, and it's placing those in our routing table as a route. So what I want to do is use OSPF so I can just kind of add and remove networks on the fly whenever they come up, and then it gets propagated to all my routers. Now the problem with this configuration is that every time I add a network to my OSPF network, I got to go in and I got to add that IP to the allowed list on all my VPN tunnels, and that is just a pain. And also, OSPF can't even communicate over the VPN if I don't specifically allow the multicast addresses that OSPF communicates on, which is I think 224.0.0.5 and 6 if I remember right. Might be 4 and 5, can't really remember. But we're just going to go ahead and disable that allowed IPs crap, which is the way that I like to do it with my WireGuard VPNs. Just because basically we're going to open it up to everything and allow OSPF to dictate the routing. So as long as there's an OSPF route to go over the tunnel, it'll go over the tunnel. We're just going to modify our existing configuration on our Edgerouter X. And all we need to do is enter configure mode again and do a delete interfaces WireGuard WG0 peer, and then if we just hit tab, if we only have one peer, we can hit tab and it'll auto-populate that peer. If you do a question mark, it'll show you all the different peers you have, so you don't have to copy and paste that every time. But we'll go ahead and do a question mark here. Oh, apparently we can't do a question mark here. So the command we're wanting to remove is allowed IPs and whatever allowed IPs we configured, which was 192.168.1.0/24 and 10.0.0.0/30. Now the downside to actually viewing these commands is that they don't show up in the configuration. So if you don't remember what networks you put in your allowed list, then you don't really know which ones to remove either. But we're going to change those. So instead of delete, we're going to do a set. And instead of a specific network, we're going to do all zeros. 0.0.0.0/0. And this effectively allows any IP that wants to go over it. Now the other command we're going to change is the set interfaces WireGuard WG0 route allowed IPs. We're going to change that from true to false. So what this does is it stops it from, it's supposed to stop that all zeros route from actually going into the routing table. We'll see if that's true or not. It's kind of hit or miss. But we'll go ahead and do a commit. And now we have changed it to open up the tunnel to use something like OSPF. And if we exit out of configuration mode and do a show IP route, this should look different. So yep, we have our regular static route. This route still technically shows up, but it doesn't really hurt anything. I don't think it does anything really, so we can just ignore that. But what we don't see is any more kernel routes. Still see this OSPF route for some reason. But now we'll actually configure OSPF. So I'm hoping that if you're wanting to configure this protocol, you kind of already have an idea of what you're doing, but we'll just kind of go through this quickly. So set protocols, OSPF area 0 network, and here's where we're going to define the networks that are on this router. So this is the opposite of the actual WireGuard configuration where we were defining which networks we want to connect to. This is which networks we want to advertise and which ones we have right here. So 192.168.10.0/24 as well as 10.0.0.0. Oh, and that's a /30, not a /24. Now another thing I like to do with my OSPF is to do a passive interface default, just so that OSPF isn't running on any of the interfaces by default, and then I manually exclude which interfaces I want to actually participate. So passive interface exclude WG0. And we'll go ahead and commit that. OSPF should start up, and we'll save it. And if we exit out of configure mode and do a show IP OSPF neighbor, we shouldn't see anything because we haven't enabled it on the other side yet. So at this point, we can switch over to our computer connected to the Edgerouter 4. Go ahead and enter configure mode, and we need to do those same delete commands over here. So delete interfaces, WireGuard WG0, peer, allowed IPs, and then 192.168.10.0/24 and 10.0.0.0/30, and as well as setting allowed IPs to all zeros. And we need to go back to the beginning of that line and change it to set, and also set the interface's route, WG0's route allowed IPs to false. Go ahead and commit that, just make sure there's no errors, and we'll go ahead and just do OSPF while we're here. So set protocols, OSPF area 0, 10.0.0.0/30. Oh, it says it's not valid. Why is that not valid? Set protocols, OSPF area 0. Oh, I forgot the network keyword, and that's why. 10.0.0.0/30. And our other local network, which is 192.168.1.1, well, 1.0/24. And we'll go ahead and do the passive interface thing. So passive interface default and passive interface exclude WireGuard 0. Now at this point we can do a commit and a save, and we should have a neighborship at least beginning to form. So we'll do a show IP OSPF neighbor, and we're not seeing anything yet. Yeah, and there we go, we rerun it, and actually we're in state full. So OSPF should be running. If we do a show IP route, yep, we have our OSPF route. And if we try to ping the other end here, 192.168.10.1, yep, we can, as well as 10.0.0.1. So basically, we have the exact same thing that we've always had. We didn't leave or lose any ability on our WireGuard VPN by running OSPF. However, now, instead of having to add those allow IP commands for every network that we want to add in the future, we just have to add them to OSPF, and automatically any router participating in OSPF is going to get those routes. So that's kind of a personal preference for me. I like to overcomplicate things, so I use OSPF on all my routers. You know, no, it's not necessary. Yes, it is a little bit overkill, but it might save me, like, I don't know, 5 minutes every 6 months when I do a reconfiguration. So hopefully you learned something in this video. This was a video that I'd been planning to do for quite a while and just never really took the time to learn how to set up WireGuard. There are a few guides online I know that you can find. The best one I think is just that GitHub page and the installation section. There was a few I looked at before that kind of referenced an old GitHub repository that's no longer maintained, as well as some other commands that are pretty specific to a client VPN setup. Now again, the main reason for WireGuard is speed over OpenVPN. However, IPsec is technically the fastest on an Edgerouter because it can offload that straight into hardware, but the downside of that is you can't have tunnel interfaces and use dynamic host names. You have to use IPs, which sometimes change if they're dynamic. So hopefully you'll learn something from this video, and as always, happy networking.